Hey everybody, it's my birthday. I thought we'd celebrate this year by me reviewing the game Transistor for PC and PlayStation 4. This is an action-adventure game, although a lot of people like to refer to it as an action role-playing game for various reasons, because they also did the exact same thing with Bastion, even though it really was more of an action-adventure game than anything else. Regardless, it was developed by Supergiant Games and released in May of this year to a massive amount of acclaim across the board. People generally loved it quite a lot. A lot of people said it was even better than Bastion. And that's a pretty big claim, considering that Bastion has become one of my favorite games in general, and was my game of the year when it came out. And that was after having played the demo and actually not being impressed by the demo. Turned out the full game was far, far better. So Transistor comes around, and the hype train is immense because, let's face it, this indie studio just came out of nowhere with Bastion and blew everybody away. So, did they repeat that with Transistor, or was this a matter of the hype train fueling the wild praise that the game got when it came out? Well, one thing that they certainly weren't going off the hype train about is the presentation. For one, this game is absolutely gorgeous. The environments are absolutely packed with detail. The actual aesthetic itself, the art style, is extremely well done and very reminiscent of what happened with Bastion. Actually, they went for a very specific style with this almost hand-painted look in a lot of respects, and ended up with something that's very unique. It's very instantly recognizable, and in a world where we've got tons and tons of sci-fi games, this really does stand alone as something very unique, just because of its visual style. That's not to say that the texture work is super high res, or the modeling is so detailed it makes your eyes bleed, or anything like that. But every single bit of the visuals in this game is phenomenally done for what it is. And what they did with that art style really does propel the game forward. And then there's the sound design. The sound design was one of the biggest points with Bastion, and there is no exception here. In fact, the soundtrack, I feel, is actually a bit better than Bastion's, mostly because they integrated it more into the game. Bastion's soundtrack was really good, don't get me wrong. It was absolutely fantastic, and I still listen to a lot of it to this day. But with Transistor, a lot of the music really does fit into what you're doing, and so it feels more like it belongs in the game than just something standing on its own. And when you're actually in the game, you really do get into it just because of the music. It is, of course, the same composer, Darren Korb, and you do have, I believe her name is Ashley Barrett, doing the vocals for a few songs as well, like in Bastion, and they just knocked it out of the park with this one. The soundtrack is phenomenal. The rest of the sound design is also very, very well done. You have people returning from Bastion, namely Logan Cunningham, who was the narrator in Bastion, has returned as the Transistor in this. He's this spirit within the sword, basically. And he does a phenomenal job here. It's a very different feel from what he did in the other games he's been in that I've gone through. And he's really showing that he can do more than just what he got known for, which was being Rux in Bastion. So I do very much applaud him on his effort with this. He did a phenomenal job. There are other people doing voice work in this as well, and they all do a very good job as well. So all in all, the sound effects are the only real blemish on what is otherwise an absolutely phenomenal presentation overall. The only real bad thing I can say about the sounds, though, is that they work, and they're not much more than that. So really, that's not a big criticism, or even a criticism at all. It's just a statement of what things are. So the presentation in this game is absolutely phenomenal across the board, except for in the sound effects, but in the grand scheme, they don't matter as much. Now, obviously what really matter in this game are the story and the gameplay, and because it's a Supergiant game, the plot is especially important in both the way it's told and what it actually is. You see, that was one of the biggest things Bastion had going for it. It had a non-traditional style of storytelling that really worked for it, and that actually would not work as well here. They've done something a bit similar, but you don't have the story unfolding around you as if being told by Rux himself and he's sitting there narrating your story. You don't really get that with Transistor. The story is unfolding around you, but you're there to experience it with these characters as opposed to just having someone tell things as you're doing them and being like, well, just rages for a while or something like that. So it's something that works better for what they decided to do with this plot. And in this plot, you play as Red, who is a singer in the city of Cloudbank. And one day she gets attacked by a group called the Camerata. Escapes with her life, but ends up with this great sword called the Transistor. And this man got absorbed by it somehow. And so his mind is still in the sword, and it will talk to her and things like that. But she loses her voice, which obviously for a singer like Red, who is basically the city's premier singer and artist, it's a pretty big deal. And so you go through the game without Red being able to talk. And so basically the sword talks for her. And through the sword and the environment and things that are going on, you learn more and more and more about the city of Cloudbank, its inhabitants, how life was there. And you learn more and more about this weird man inside the sword and Red, because they clearly have a history together. You just don't know what it is. And the way that the story is told, it really does make you want to know more. It gives you hints here and there. And it says, basically, oh, you want to learn more about this? Go and find it. And so you do have to go out of your way to actually find all of the data entries and things like that to get the full story. But when you get there, you feel like you've experienced something greater than just a plot of, oh, well, you're going after this group that attacked you and finding out why they attacked you and what their plot is and why this weird force called the Process, which are basically living computer programs, are taking over the city and repurposing it and things like that. Basically attacking it. And so the plot gets more complicated, especially toward the end of the game, but I don't want to spoil it for you because it really is the strongest point in this game. And if you're going into this thing expecting something like Bastion, which, don't get me wrong, was a fantastic game in its own right, but the plot was a very different style from this. It was kind of a forlorn thing. It was post-apocalyptic, really, but it was hopeful. And a lot of this is just downright depressing, but in a good way. I know, depressing and in a good way, that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, does it? But it's a grim plot. The Process are basically just annihilating the city, and you're caught in it. You are watching this city get completely taken over by the Process, and everything you know and love gets destroyed in the process. And so the plot ends up being very depressing. But it's the moments that you share with the sword and the moments with the other characters that you find that really make it a lot more than just depressing, and it makes it so much more enjoyable by the end. And the ending itself was something that was very, very bittersweet, but very, very effective as well. So, with that all said, what about the gameplay? Because the gameplay is also a big part here. The gameplay is very interesting. You can play it as pretty much a straight-up action-adventure game, or you can play it as a more tactical game. You can just run up to things and start whacking them in the face with the sword and that sort of thing, or you can activate turns, where you can plan out moves and then instantly activate them. And you'll find that certain situations call for the more action-oriented approach, and others it's really more important to do the turn mechanic, because that actually does have a cooldown. So there's some interesting mechanics associated with that. You can place various abilities within the sword. The first one you get is called Crash. It's a basic melee attack, basically. But you get additional abilities later on, and these can range from straight-up attack powers to things like Jaunt, which, if you have it as an active power, which I'll explain in a moment, you can just do a quick, basically instant dash, and that doesn't really have a cooldown, so you can just keep going all over the place. It gets out of danger quickly. Or you can do something else and lay a trap, for instance. Now, if you have something placed as an enhancer ability for one of your active abilities, it's going to change the way it functions. Maybe instead of just being this beam attack, well, now it goes through enemies, or now it chains to other enemies, or things like that. And then there's other abilities you can have where you place them in another slot and they just enhance your character herself. Maybe they give a much faster cooldown on the turn, for instance, or maybe they give you the ability to do more things in a turn, something like that. So what am I talking about here? Well, whenever you get an ability, it's basically something getting absorbed into the transistor, and so you are swapping abilities out in the various slots that you have within the transistor. You can do this at any access point in the game. You can just swap out any of your abilities that you want in any combination that you want, so long as you fit within the memory limit. And you can, of course, expand that later on. That's basically what leveling up is for. As you level up, you will get access to more memory and more slots and things like that. And sometimes you'll just get straight up abilities. And you come to find out that each of these abilities is basically the mind of a person. And as you use these abilities in certain ways, it will actually reveal more about that person. So you have both the incentive of, well, I want to experiment with the gameplay and try all these different combinations and find out what works best for me. And if you're into the story, you get to experience more of that story by using all these abilities. So it encourages basically back and forth. It's a very weird way of doing things that works out very well. And combat itself is actually pretty challenging. You'll find that there's quite a bit of tactical depth to it, where you'll have to prioritize certain targets, and certain enemies will actually be able to shield their allies, or certain enemies will have certain special abilities that allow them to have sometimes the same kind of abilities that you do. Like some of them do jaunt kind of maneuvers and things like that. Some of them basically knock you down when they attack you or stun you, that sort of thing. And some of them just do a massive amount of damage, so you just want to avoid them. So you do have to think more than your typical action-adventure game where you're just kind of spamming buttons. And it's toward the later parts of the game where the turn mechanic really comes in handy. That said, sometimes it does get rather repetitive. So if you're stuck in a situation where, for instance, you have taken enough damage to actually lose one of your abilities, because that's what happens when you take damage. Once you take enough damage and your health bar is depleted, one of your abilities basically crashes, and so you can't use that one, and anything that was associated with it is basically wasted. And once you get to a certain number of access points, it recharges and you're perfectly good to go again. But it does have a basic cooldown. There is an incentive to not dying, basically. And so situations like that, where, for instance, your particularly powerful ability, because it does go for the higher value abilities first when it comes to crashing your abilities. When your better ability that you were using for combos is taken out, then you're stuck with everything else, and it may not be ideal for the situation at hand, so that can get rather repetitive and tedious sometimes. But that's mostly on you.
Get ready to get jumped.
So it's more of a matter of playing it smart, avoiding damage where you can, going in there and getting sneak attacks from behind or something like that, so you'll do extra damage. Use certain combinations of abilities so you'll be able to do particularly massive amounts of damage. Things like that. That make it a fairly deep game where you do have to try a lot of different things and find out what works, what doesn't work for you, and use what you want, really. There's a lot of room for customization there. Some people will play certain ways, others will play other ways. So you get to infuse yourself into this as well. Makes things interesting. Now, that all said, apart from a few instances where they give you trial rooms, like take out a certain number of enemies within the time limit, or you have to collect all the stuff before the enemies respawn or something like that, in this bizarre beach-like area where you're basically resting, and it's just a chance to move away from the story and just try some gameplay things out, or just listen to the music if you want to, because let's face it, the music in this game is fantastic, and they realized it, so they stuck in an area and they let you play the music that you've unlocked and things like that. But apart from these trial rooms, there's not a huge amount of variety in the gameplay. It's basically the same idea repeated until the end of the game. It's not a particularly long game. I would clock it around somewhere between 6 and 7 hours, and so it's really not that long. It doesn't overstay its welcome. There is a New Game Plus mode, so once you finish the game, you can go back in New Game Plus. You still have all of your abilities and everything leveled up as you were, and now the enemies are tougher. And that's actually what you're seeing in this video. You're seeing all New Game Plus. And I tried to avoid spoilers as much as possible, so I stuck to the early parts of the game and tried to avoid cutscenes and such like that. So it does have replay value, and you can go back and try different combinations of abilities and things like that and get different results. But the plot's going to be, as far as I can tell, exactly the same. I haven't actually finished New Game Plus mode, but as far as I can tell, it's the exact same game, just with tougher enemies, and now you've got all your abilities maxed out and things like that. So the game is entirely focused around its plot. And so the situation does arise that people who don't really get anything out of story-based games will not really be able to get much out of Transistor. But for everyone else, the people who really do like story-driven games, particularly games where they make you actually kind of go out of your way to find out the whole truth, and people who are looking for more than just a typical storyline in a game, Transistor is the game for you. And it's kind of weird talking about this because you hear me comparing it to Bastion a lot, because that's the only other game that Supergiant has done. They have made 2 games, and thus far both of them have been absolutely phenomenal. The few issues I do have with this game are mostly just personal problems. Just me getting tired of fighting certain enemies where I just was not having a particularly good time, just the way I had my abilities set up or something like that, or I was just not feeling good that day or something like that. It was all on me. It wasn't on the game itself. I never ran into any technical problems. It was smooth as silk. It ran great both on gaming computer and on my laptop, actually. And so it stands out as an extremely high quality release that has really put Supergiant even more on the map than they already were. They were on the map in a big way with Bastion, but Transistor is something that's different for them. They didn't want to just do Bastion all over again, and so they did something different, and it worked too. So with Transistor, they've really made themselves into a name I really want to pay more attention to. I'm really looking forward to what these guys can put out now and see if they can even top Transistor, because I have to say, Transistor is much better than Bastion.
I think I know where everyone went.
And I didn't think I could actually say that, but it is. I was worried as hell that the game actually would not be particularly good when it actually came out. But they proved me wrong. And I am so glad they proved me wrong. Because Transistor is a phenomenal experience that, apart from people who can't get into story-driven games, I can pretty much recommend to anybody. Is it a must-own? Now that is where I have to ask myself, would I recommend this to anybody? Despite that demographic that won't really get anything out of it, I do have to say I would recommend this game to anyone as something that they should own in their collection. I give it a 5 out of 5. Thanks for watching.